So as long as we get that straight. So here is the agenda that I may or may not follow, depending on how interactive we make this. But since we are going to talk about innovation in emerging markets, I thought I would step a little back and try to define what we mean by innovation, what do we mean by emerging markets, and what do we mean by innovation in emerging markets. And we're going to talk about Brazil and Russia in particular. We could talk about all 28. There will be a quiz towards the end, so how many emerging markets are there? 28, very good. Then we'll talk a little bit about the strategy for innovation in emerging markets. So, on innovation, I thought to ask, what is innovation all about? So, I went to the biggest source of knowledge these days, Wikipedia, and that's how they define innovation. Actually, innovation comes from the Latin, innovare, so you're in the same place. But innovating, when translated from Latin to English, actually means change. And this is actually a very interesting concept because, oops, I don't know how I did that, but innovation is about the creation of better or more effective processes, products, systems, or ideas that can be readily available in the market, government, and society. So innovation is not just about the idea, but it's about the creation of a product and the availability of that in the market, government, or society. And that actually differs from, that actually differs from invention and improvement. Invention is just the idea. Improvement is how to change a particular process to enhance the world. But innovation is when you create something genuinely new that can then be consumed in a market. Okay? So now what are emerging markets? Emerging markets are the nations that are in the process, either business-oriented or social-oriented, of rapid growth and industrialization. Now, why do I think this is really, really, really important? Because there are 28 of them out there, even though we are going to focus only on BRIC. How many of you know what BRIC stands for? Excellent. Brazil, Russia, India, and China. A lot of people now are talking about BRICS to include either South Africa or the sub-Saharan Africa. And they actually matter because they are growing at a faster pace than everybody else. So in this graph here, the red line shows an index. You don't need to worry about how the index is calculated. But the growth in the red is a worldwide trend. In the dark blue, which is the second to the highest, is on the 28 emerging markets. And the one at the top high talks about the BRIC countries, only the 4 of them. So it actually matters. Now, how have we innovated in emerging markets? So you say, you know what, this is actually something new that is happening today, or is it something that we have done in the past? There is a lot of confusion out there about what is the difference between emerging markets or markets that we colonized in the 500 years ago, 400 years ago, or 300 years ago. And if you think that innovation is colonization 2.0, if you think that innovation in emerging markets is just exploration or exploitation of the opportunities, then we have a problem. And I think that is the main point of this presentation today. Okay? Now, let's talk a little bit about this notion of inclusive growth. The World Economic Forum has one annual meeting at Davos, January, February time frame, and then it has a local meeting in certain regions. Last year, they had the Latin American regional meeting in Brazil. And one of the best sessions from my perspective was this idea of inclusive growth. And the point was that these BRIC countries and these emerging economies are actually going through a period of economic growth. But this economic growth will only be inclusive growth if, for example, it drives educational growth, if it drives cultural growth, if it drives social growth, if it drives sustainable growth, meaning that after the developed countries cease investment, after the developed countries are no longer present in their emerging economies, that the country continues to grow. If it drives cross-geography growth, sometimes when you are in the colonization period, for example, or in an exploration phase, growth is very limited within a certain geographical region, and you don't allow migration from rural areas to urban areas and so on and so forth. If it drives technological growth, but most importantly, if it drives value retention growth, okay? Meaning the value that the emerging economy is generating, a great part of that has to be retained in the local region. Okay? So now let me tell you a little bit about Brazil. And I'll tell you a tale of Brazil, and I am fully qualified because I was born there, so I know my people. So let me talk to you about the tale of Brazil and coffee beans. Today, we consume about 2.25 billion cups of coffee on a daily basis. 90% of the coffee is produced in developing markets, in emerging nations, right? The major consumption are in industrial economies. Brazil produces 1/3 of the worldwide coffee. That's about 2.59 million of metric tons. By the way, you measure by the metric ton, the metric of sacks that have a ton of coffee. Now, who is the second biggest, largest producer of coffee in the world? Colombia? Who else? Any other guess? Africa, right? No, it's actually Vietnam. Vietnam produces about 0.85 million metrics of ton, and the third is Colombia, which produces about 0.70. But you see that the second and the third summed together can roughly come to about half of what Brazil produces. About 3 billion coffee plants exist in Brazil, and over 5 billion Brazilians across history have either worked or been involved or benefited from coffee plantations. Now, let's take a look a little bit about how the market, if you could please thank you. Let's take a little bit look about on the economic side, okay? So we looked at numbers, let's take a look at on the economic side. 1 pound of commodity coffee sells for about $1.20, okay? Now, you don't even have to worry because the coffee that you buy at Starbucks or at your coffee shop is not commodity coffee. That's a specialized coffee that costs twice as much because it comes on a different packaging, okay? The coffee comes from exactly the same place, I assure you. Now, 1 pound of coffee yields about 45 8-ounce cups of coffee. I went actually to Starbucks and I asked, and I looked at their documentation because I wanted this to be fact-based. Then 1 ounce of cup, then how much of coffee beans does it actually consume? If you divide 2.52, which is the cost of the pound, by 45, you get about 56, I don't even know, 5 cents, right? Let's round it off to 6 cents, okay? Now, if you pay $1.40 for 8 ounces of coffee, 0.56 cents is about 4% of the value chain. So Brazil, number 1, produces more than almost twice as much as the second and the third place. How much of the value chain does it capture? Very little, right? Coffee is produced in underdeveloped countries. It is consumed in developed countries, and that's where you have a non-inclusive growth, an economic growth that is not sustainable and that is not good for the local economy. But, you know, we Brazilians believe that God is indeed Brazilian. And it gave us coffee We didn't make much of it. It gave us sugar cane. We didn't make much of it. It gives us a third chance, which is what we call coffee 2.0 or oil and gas. So yeah, that gets interesting because Brazil actually found a major oil reserve. Now you can say, why have you found it only now? Haven't you noticed we are just too lazy? But by 2000, and why hurry? Really, there is no point. By 2015, Brazil will become a net oil exporter. Brazil is an oil exporter today, but there are two types of oils, the light and the heavy, and in one of them, we don't have enough for internal consumption. By 2015, we are going to be completely independent. Petrobras, the Brazilian petroleum company, will be the 5th largest oil company in the world. And by 2020, Brazil is going to produce about 5.7 million barrels of oil a day. And you ask, what does that mean? Because you don't pay attention how many barrels of oil get produced. This is more than half of what Saudi Arabia produces on a daily basis. Brazil is not in the Middle East. We don't know how to spell terrorism. We kill each other when we have a conflict, and that's the end of that. And we have never been to a world war. Why? Because if we cannot solve with a gun locally or with a beer at the beach, it's not worth fighting at all, right? So there you get some tectonic changes that is going to happen when Brazil starts producing that much oil. Now, there is only one caveat that I would like to share with you. Have you seen the movie There Will Be Blood? Yes, very entertaining movie if you want to lose weight. I spent 3 days without eating after that spy-induced entertainment. But that's a scene from the movie. It's one of my favorite scenes. And for those of you that have not seen the movie, what do you think that scene is about? They're looking for oil. But for the naked eye, you may think that they are camping, right? Family quality time, father and son weekend, right? But they are not. They are actually looking on the ground. That's called, by the way, R&D, 50 years ago. And they are looking on the ground and see if there was any oil that was coming out of the earth. And when they see something black, they taste, they feel the texture and say, that's not water, that's not dirt, that must be oil. And by the way, they put a drill and there is oil. It wasn't that easy with Brazil. Brazil oil reserve actually is 7,000 meters below the surface of the water. In fact, it is actually protected by a layer of salt of 3,000 meters. And that's why this oil reserve is called pre-salt, because it's below the salt layer. There is also the post-salt, a little bit on top, but a little on top is not going to take us any place meaningful. It is the oil that is below the salt of the layer that is going to make the difference. Furthermore, that oil reserve is more than 300 kilometers from the shore. Why is that important? Because a helicopter cannot make a round trip of 300 kilometers each way without refilling. So then the trips become very expensive because instead of carrying 5 passengers, you have to put 3 and carry 2 barrels of oil in place. So you want to minimize people going back and forth. In fact, they say that they want to take all the humans from the platform except for a dog and a man. Why do you need the dog? To make sure that no one touches the machines. Why do you need the man? To feed the dog, right? So I would like actually to ask you to look at that picture and literally freeze for one moment. Keep that picture in your mind because I'm going to take you through a detour. And the detour is going to be talking about why should we care? Why am I on information technology? Why am I working for a company on information technology? And why am I talking about oil and gas and the situation in Brazil? You may have not heard that there is a data explosion out there. You may have been completely insulated from all the mobile devices, and I envy you, but we have generated in 2010 about 1.2 zettabytes of data. Now, you may say, I don't know what a zettabyte is. I'm going to walk you through. Everything started when somebody defined the term of a bit, which was either 0 or 1. Then 8 bits became a byte. 1,000 bytes became a kilobyte. 1,000 kilobytes became a megabyte. 1,000 megabytes became a gigabyte. 1,000 gigabytes became a terabyte. 1,000 a peta. 1,000 an exa. 1,000 a zetta. Okay? Now, I actually love an analogy that someone in the US government made one day. If 1 byte was 1 gallon of water, this would be the size of the Atlantic Ocean. Okay? Now, you say it would be very, very good if that's all that it had and it was not growing. But it's growing at a rate of 44 times. So by the way, by 2020, you're going to have 35.2 zettabytes, whatever that means, right? How many oceans we are going to have. There won't be enough oceans in the globe to make up for the amount of data. By the way, the people that actually manage that data is going to grow by less than 50%. So you need some innovation. Where is that data being driven from? It's being driven from what is called the connected era. You know what is the connected era? It's an era where your health is no longer measured by your cardiogram, blood pressure, cholesterol level, but by the number of bars that you get in your mobile device, right? And whenever that is low, you actually bear a heart attack. Now, because of that connected area, then you have the birth of what is called big data. How many of you have heard the term big data? Brilliant. What is that? Right? I don't know. And how big is big data? No idea. So let's take a look of what big data is. Big data, and I love our marketing person that says, not ever a term so vague meant so much to so many. You have here big data. That is data that comes at a high volume. These are data that big images that come along. All data that comes at a high velocity. They are generated very, very fast. Variety of sources is data that is coming from your iPhone, from your blog, from GPS in your car, from sensors that you have measuring the weather, from the devices that you have in your company, from everywhere. The data can be very structured. The data can be very unstructured, like images that you tape on a daily basis. Data that brings complexity. How many of you have entered a building that you saw a guy looking, a security guy, sorry, looking at 8 screens at a time, staring all day long, and you think, how come I didn't get that job, right? And it actually turns out to be that one of the most complex analyses that you can do is image analysis. How can you actually look at an image and see one person that actually came in a room in a funny way and say, aha, that person is actually trying to plot something bad? That's very, very complex. That's big data for you. It's all data that challenges existing information infrastructure capabilities. And why do we use the term existing? And why do we say that makes us think different today? Because big data is a relative measure. What is big today, hey, may not be so big tomorrow. And what is big today? It's something that challenges you to think differently, to do things in a different way. How relevant is big data? Maybe you say, you know, really big data is not my problem. Big data is Facebook's problem. Big data is Google's problem. Big data is somebody else's problem, not mine. I have been in this business for 15 years. Yes, I started really young. But I have been in 15. I have talked to CIOs, to CTOs, to COOs. For the first time in my career, from a technology perspective, I'm talking to CMOs, Chief Marketing Officers. And I'm talking to Chief Production Officers. And I'm talking to people that I don't know what the acronym actually means, and I cannot map In a presentation, what is that person doing? Because they are coming from everywhere trying to figure out how they are going to apply big data on their daily lives. Why? Because their bosses are telling them it's going to change the way you do business. He just didn't say how, right? Now, the US government, towards the end of March 28th or 29th, or maybe both days, they had a meeting. And they had a WebEx, and I encourage you to actually listen. It's an hour and 20 minutes, but I will give you the executive summary here. Obama, 18 months ago, said, how are we doing in relation to big data? He assigned a committee. The committee took a couple of months, came back and said, you are underinvesting. The US government is not strategic in the context of big data. You need to do something about it. So he actually called the executive directors of DARPA, the Department of Defense, Department of Energy, NIH, which is the National Institutes of Health, and so on and so forth. And each one actually did an evaluation of how they could use big data more effectively and what projects they would do to actually work on big data. And at the end of March on that WebEx, they actually gave a presentation on what projects they would work on. By the way, that's where the government funding is going to go. And the call to action it's not just about the data. The data is a means towards an end. We want to analyze the data to transform that into knowledge, and we want to use that knowledge to drive automatic actions. So watch out. Now, where is EMC? EMC considers itself developing technologies for cloud and big data. Now, if cloud transforms IT, it's the same way that you no longer, when you're going to open an office, you no longer take a generator with you, right? Because you have electricity that comes from the utility company. You don't need to actually bring a well to store water for the dry days. You will not need to build a data center. That's how cloud transforms IT, but it's at the infrastructure level. Big data will transform the way you do business. How many of you have bought a book on Amazon? Excellent, good for Amazon. What is the first thing that comes out on your screen when you say, I'm looking for a book on big data? Suggestions that says, okay, people that bought this book also bought the other books. That suggestion turns out to be one of the most complex analytic problems using big data, because it builds a huge network, a social network, or big graph of purchase patterns between people in an organization. And that analytics is very, very, very advanced and is also used by Facebook to make suggestions of what groups and communities you should participate on. That's what we call predictive analytics, because it's trying to guess which other books you could or should buy. And it is also we call embedded. For the naked eye, you don't really have an idea of how Amazon got to that conclusion, but you really liked the iDevice. That's where EMC is in that technology. Where does big data come from? It comes from everywhere, including geophysical exploration, and that's why we are looking into Brazil. Because the geophysical exploration, the only reason why they could find oil 7,000 meters below the surface of the water is because they were capable of putting sensors that were generating quadrillions of files, and some files had more than 5 terabytes of size. So now this is the end of the tour, and I'll ask you to start unfreezing, and I'll bring you back to the same picture where we were. Why were we able to find that oil? Because if you're looking for big data, look no more. Oil and gas is one of the areas that is building the largest wealth of big data banks. Because before you generate a seismic image like you were seeing here on your left, you have to process terabytes and terabytes of data. The exploration of oil and gas is very, very complex. It's very siloed. You have groups of scientists that work together on each phase, big data transformation phase. By the way, each one of those phases lasts between 6 months and 2 years. That's why it takes so long. right? And if someone at the end of the chain says, yeah, I want to look at a file at the beginning of the chain because I'm not sure you used the right parameter on the simulation, it takes 6 months to retrieve the data. And the dream is that these analyses will be done on a global basis. By the way, the oil, the source of the data, is typically in a terrain that is very hard to reach. It's usually a typical a war zone, I'm sorry. And you want to actually share the data in a more efficient way. What are the innovation trends that are happening there? You have huge problems because you have more images at high precisions being measured more often. And what is happening is that you have big data being generated. And you should say, why should I care about oil and gas? By the way, there is a huge deficit in personnel for oil and gas for the past 10, 15 years because everybody thought that oil and gas was not cool. And the people that were graduating from college, they said, you know what? I'm going to study renewable energies because they are much better. And yes, you should study renewable energies and wind energy and solar energy and wave energy. It's all good because that is going to allow the emerging markets to have access to electricity. Because the developed countries will, what we produce in oil and gas today will have to continue growing at the same rate just to keep up with the normal growth. And the equivalent of the renewable energy will be the surplus that we need for the emerging economies to have access to the same utilities that we take for granted. So Brazil decided, okay, if I need to explore and find that oil, I am going to invest. So Brazil needed an investment of $225 billion. It did the largest IPO of the Brazilian Petroleum Company, but it had one caveat. All that investment, it acquired debt, and all that investment was going to be done in country. So now you have the problem here because you have an emerging economy that is actually seen as an exploration or an exploitation site that is saying, I have an RFP in a year from now. And one of the criteria in that RFP is that you have an innovation and research and development facility in country. And if you don't, you can't participate. You can say it's fair or it's unfair, but they don't want to go through the same process that they haven't before, that they capture 0.4% of the value chain, right? Now, 85% of the oil in Brazil, it's outside of the coast of Rio de Janeiro. The governor says that if Rio was a country, he would be a shaker. And the university, the Federal University, which is the biggest university, said actually houses the SEMPS, which is called is the Research Center for Petrobras, has been there since 1970, and they created a technology park, which is the orange area. And in order to be in that technology park, you have to make 3 commitments. You first have to apply for a public tender, and if you are approved, then you have to, number 1, lease the land for 20 years. So you can't give up, you know, after 2 years, say, oops, I made a mistake. You're stuck there for 20 years. Number 2, you have to build a building. And number 3, you have to invest about $1.5 million a year for the first 5 years in relationship with the university. And who have they attracted? Some, I don't know if you're familiar with oil and gas, but this is equivalent of, I don't even know, Intel, of coprocessors, but you have Schlumberger, Landmark, Tenaris, Siemens Chemistry and Technology, and Baker Hughes, and many more. And EMC made an investment. Actually, GE is in that peninsula. By the way, GE is going to generate 1,000 jobs, and EMC came and is the only IT company inside of the technology park. To analyze and understand big data in that emerging economy, Obama went to Brazil in March last year and said we need a commitment to innovation and technology, which is why we have agreed to expand cooperation between our scientists, research, and engineers between Brazil and the US. It's a completely different type of relationship. Now let's talk about Russia. What is happening in Russia? Russia is the 8th largest consumer of legal drugs, pharmaceutical drugs, in the world. And there is a huge imbalance between how much of that is produced in-house and how much of that is actually imported. By the way, another interesting thing about Russia is that almost 100% of that pharmaceutical market is paid by the government. So we are now looking at the government here doing a huge import on the 8th largest market of pharmaceutical drugs. How big is the import? By volume, 70 to 80% is actually imported. Russia only produces internally about, in volume, 20 to 25%. However, the 20 to 25% that it produces is what is called simple drugs. Tylenol, Advil, drugs that are very easy to manufacture, biosimilar drug or a compound equivalent. So all the intelligent drugs are actually imported. So Russia said at one point, this is a national security threat, because if I am in fight with some countries and I can no longer import drugs, the whole nation is at risk. So what have the Russians done? Actually, before I tell you about what the Russians have done, let's talk a little bit about what is happening in healthcare. There is a medicine revolution out there. In fact, they are talking about the 4P medicines. I don't know if you, the 4P medicine, I don't know if you have heard the term, is the fact that medicine in the future is going to be highly participatory. So we, as a consumer, will not be obliged to take the opinion of the doctor as is. We will have a say on our treatment. We will be able to do research and participate on all of that. Number two is going to be preventive. So we are going to get a lot of information about how to prevent lung cancer, how to prevent this type of high blood pressure or sugar and so on and so forth. And it's going to be predictive. So we will know more about you and your lifestyle and your DNA to be able to say that you have a high likelihood of something happening to you and that you need to treat in advance. And number four, which is one of the most important transformations in the history of healthcare and of medicine, is the fact that you're going to have personalized medicine. And the idea of personalized medicine is to say, to actually differentiate people not based on color or gender or social background, but based on your DNA, on your genome composition. Is to understand that you have what is called a biomarker, a misspelling or a different spelling of your DNA. And because of that, you can't process, for example, a particular drug compound. So it's equivalent, it's not the same, but equivalent of saying you are lactose intolerant. Or you cannot process a particular medicine because your DNA doesn't have the instructions to do that. So if I give you a medication, not only to be ineffective, but it may be harmful because I may poison you with something, poison your body with something that cannot be processed. For those of you that have that are lactose intolerant, one of the symptoms they say is that when they drink milk, they feel intoxicated because your body has too much of something that it doesn't know how to eliminate. Well, Russia actually paid attention and said, by the way, personalized medicine is based on an understanding of your DNA, and it's based on a lot of analytics. And they had an epiphany because they no longer need a lot of the so-called wet samples, blood samples, tissue samples, and mucose samples. Once you digitize all that information, and it becomes really a digital file, it can be processed anywhere. And who has one of the best know-hows in the world on analytics? Who has one of the hugest, the strongest math background in the world? Russia. Now, let's take a look at something else. A genome, your DNA, has nothing more, nothing less than 6.4 billion characters. I come from EMC storage. I can't help but smile, right? It's 6.4 billion. I did the calculation that if we were to have one DNA sample for the entire population by 2050, that would be alone over 50 exabytes. To be precise, 62 exabytes, but who is got? Okay? Now, those genomes is if you count only your DNA, but hey, keep in mind that we want a piece of the genome from your liver, from your kidney, from every part in your body, and we want throughout the life cycle of the cell. And you want to analyze tens of thousands of them at a time. And that's when I ask you to freeze again. Why? Because I'm going to take in another tour. Why? Because genomics, proteomics, metabolomics, all the omics are going to create more big data, right? And if you look at this picture of the 5+ terabytes, then you're going to see that it comes not only from geophysical exploration, but also from bioinformatics. And if you want freeze, now I am back to the 6.4 billion, the analysis over 10,000, and that's where Russia is. Russia created two things, Pharma 2020, which is a project that by the year 2020, Russia is going to shift completely the structure of the market. They want that more than 50% of the drugs are going to be produced internally, and they want the intelligent drugs to be produced locally, either innovated within Russia or by pharmaceutical companies developing and producing in the local market. So you see an exodus of pharmaceutical companies going to Russia to actually open factory and open facility, because by 2020, the import taxes on drugs manufactured outside is going to render them non-competitive. Russia also created what is called pharma clusters. The pharmaceutical company said, well, this is great, but I cannot open a facility because you don't have the right sewage, the right water, the right electricity, the right logistics for the supply to go in and for the product to come out. And what have they done? They created 7 regions in Russia that are going to become pharma clusters, ideal regions for pharmaceutical companies to open their facilities. And they are going to invest on what is called bioinformatics, which is the application of computer science to the study of biology. Once the information is digitized, you're going to analyze that like there is no tomorrow. So we actually see a pattern here, because similarly to what in Brazil they created a technology park in Rio, they allocated a region called Skolkovo, which is really just outside of Moscow. And that region is going to become the Russian equivalent of Silicon Valley. I think that they saw a deserted area. They had 2 options. It would be either technology park or a casino, and they went for the technology park. But I think that they were like 50-50. Somebody broke the tie. And so this technology park has some characteristics very similar to Brazil. They are going to develop an entire city, and they are attracting companies, and many of the major enterprises are there already. But if you want to be part of the park, you have to focus on one of those 5 areas. One of them, of course, is biomedicine. The other one is energy efficiency, nuclear, space, and of course, IT. And that's where EMC is, again, developing an R&D center on top of Skolkovo. So now let's try to think back of what we learned today and try to talk a little bit about what does a strategy really look like? What are the patterns that we are seeing to bring innovation to emerging markets? We see a lot of change. This is not your Brazil, your Russia, your China, your India of 500 years ago or 400 years ago, and not even your emerging markets of 10 years ago, when everything you thought about to be done outside was outsourcing, was about maintenance, and was about activities that we felt it was too expensive to do locally. IT is a major player. Information technology not only stands anymore for what we do on a daily basis locally here in the US. Because of cloud and big data, information technology now is said to be an industry in transition. We believe that disrupt changes actually create lasting changes. We are in the middle of a disruptive era. We are in the middle of disruptive technologies, cloud and big data. And we want to be part of that disruption on the emerging markets. We do not want all direct innovation to happen just in the US, because I'll tell you what. I have a friend in Brazil that says there will be no parachuting, meaning that we will not be able in 5, 10 years from now parachute with a set of products and force it down into the local market, because it really has to meet their needs, and it has to be co-located and co-innovated, or otherwise you are no longer competitive. It's all about alignment. You have to really make an effort to align yourself with the changes that are happening on a worldwide basis. And at EMC, we created a simple strategy. Number one, you have to find something that has local relevance. In Brazil, all the investment is going towards oil and gas in the next couple of years. In Russia, 1/5 of the investment is going through pharmaceutical. If you actually reverse, if you're trying to talk about innovation on oil and gas in Russia or bioinformatics in Brazil, nobody will listen. Number two, you have to look for areas that have global leverage, because you do not want to develop technologies that have only one emerging market at a time, right? And number three, it has to be aligned with your vision. And that's why I took you to some detours. Because in oil and gas, I didn't suggest that EMC was going to make pipes to actually transport oil. But in fact, we were able to find the tie between oil and gas and cloud and big data. In Russia, I didn't suggest that EMC was going to start manufacturing pills or create a hospital or a clinical center. In fact, we looked for the tie between that and cloud and big data, and that was the second tool we took you about. And by tying those three together, you really create what we call an innovation fabric that provides a sustainable innovation growth. Thank you. I hope you find it informative and useful.